Hey folks, so I've been reading these past few days this book, God, the Evidence, Reconciliation of Faith and Reason in a Post-Secular World. It's by the author Patrick Glynn. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this book. I think it was popular a couple years ago. Let's see here when the copyright was. Alright, yeah, long time ago, 1999. So this book's been out for a while. Okay, so what's he basically saying? He's talking about the relationship between religion and spiritual experiences and human happiness. At least that's what I got out of the book. He makes a couple of other arguments as a case for God. He argues that the blind mechanics of the universe, now this is including biological evolution and cosmological evolution as a whole, couldn't produce us as we are now. There had to have been some other element to it that drove us to existence, I guess you could say, that helped life and consciousness emerge. So that's his argument. It's more of a philosophical argument, and he makes that clear in the book. But in a way, he's a Christian apologist, because he kind of goes over some of the arguments that, let's say, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens have made, Daniel Dennett, against a religious life, and saying, if we only got rid of religion, we would be so much more happy with ourselves, and so much more positive and rational, and we wouldn't do the same things that we did when we were thinking blindly in terms of religion. He basically takes that argument and shows that it is not the case, one, that would be happier, mentally or biologically, and two, that being rational or embracing a more scientific perspective isn't necessarily enlightening. To some degree it might be, but it doesn't ultimately help escape from the pitfalls of dogma, fundamentalism, and bias. And I think he had pretty good points, given a little bit too strong for my taste. I wouldn't go all the way in agreeing with him, but I do think he had some good arguments against a completely not quote-unquote secular understanding of the world. So yeah, one of the interesting things he mentioned in this book was that religious belief, and it doesn't necessarily mean Christian belief, but religious belief in general, actually enhanced people's lives biologically and mentally. People are mentally healthier and biologically healthier when they have a value system and or a spiritual dimension to their lives. So I thought that was interesting too. And the fact that if you didn't have that sort of spiritual dimension, you actually are prone to more biological and mental issues. So I think that's interesting. Without values, we lose something about us. It's actually detrimental to us, evolutionarily speaking, to not have values in a spiritual sense. So I think that's a very interesting study, given he's somewhat biased. But I thought it was a very, very interesting argument. But this only seems to confirm, as he was saying in the book, what science is saying about religion, that it's actually a major part of us, of our evolution. It is a compartment and dimension to the human experience. We're hardwired for religion. The majority of us are. And to not give that part its due can be detrimental. So I do agree, to some degree, of course. I don't think it should be forced. But he was basically trying to defend, himself and his beliefs and spiritual beliefs in a secular world, which is very much against them, and believes that people are happier if they grow out of religion. And his main argument is people aren't happier when they grow out of religion. Maybe they're happy when they grow out of dogma, but he basically says that's not a religious, isolated issue. It's an issue that's human. There's dogma and bias in whatever culture you go to, whether they're very spiritual or not. And he uses Thomas Kuhn, the structure of scientific revolutions, as a couple of examples as to how even scientific bias can exist. His weaker points in this book ended up being the ones that try to poke holes in evolutionary and cosmological theory. He raised interesting questions about the origins of human life and of life in general. He doesn't say evolution can't work. He basically says, yes, the mechanics are correct, they're true, they're real. But often, throughout evolution, and throughout human evolution, as in human consciousness, inventions, ideologies, the general story of human societies and their evolution, the major components of change have always been seemingly spontaneous, creative, innovative, or intuitive. And they haven't been necessarily a nice, paced, structured scientific method sort of build up. In other words, the idea in science that, discovery after discovery and the slow method of experimentation and believing basically only in, I guess you could say, what you know to be a fact at the time. That sort of structure, though it is very effective in the long run, hasn't been responsible, he argues, for the dramatic shifts in evolutions that have occurred. And he actually cites this biologically and, as I said, socially and technologically. So where does this creative, spontaneous spark of ingenuity and novelty come from? Well, he says, well, certainly not through a very, very blind or slow process. It's through something else. And he argues, maybe it's God, maybe we're going to understand that this is God eventually. And, well, for the most part, he argues, see, science doesn't answer the whole picture. They answer a lot, but they aren't the answer. So don't just cast out your faith because it's not going to lead you to happiness either. So, given all of these points, I think they're pretty strong. But I do think we just don't understand enough about cosmology and evolution to be able to say things like, natural selection is responsible for all the ingenious and novel breakthroughs throughout all of evolution. I don't think we can say that. I think we can say evolution is largely responsible for the way we are now. But there are aspects to evolution that we don't understand yet. Sudden jumps, sudden shifts, sudden, evolutionary leaps that have happened. I guess you can call them singularities in the past. Now, I think there are other alternative ways to view this besides, believing that some kind of divine intervention happened. One is that, okay, maybe we can take the law of exponential growth and apply that to evolution as Ray Kurzweil has. Now, exponential development has a very, very slow or seemingly slow build-up process. In other words, it seems like something is not really doing much, but meanwhile it's doubling over on itself to a point where it reaches a critical mass and then explodes exponentially in a new direction. It brings evolution to a critical point where it takes off, and then that explosion settles down, creating another, and that sort of process might actually explain why we've had these big jumps, and explain why we have these big jumps socially too. Another way is to argue, well, maybe some kind of divine consciousness has not necessarily intervened, but been embedded or a part of the process from the beginning. That's interesting too, teleologically and philosophically. That's an interesting argument. So yeah, I recommend this book. It's pretty interesting, it's controversial, and definitely check it out. Thanks for listening.